Welcome to This Explainer. We're diving straight into the foundational building blocks of the Keynesian ISLM model for a closed economy. If you've ever wondered how the big, invisible gears of a national economy actually turn together, well, you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to take this macroeconomic machine apart and put it back together piece by piece, so you can see exactly how the whole thing works. To get us there, here's our 6-step agenda. The macroeconomic master blueprint. Consumers, government, and taxes. Interest rates driving investment. Building the IS curve. Building the LM curve. And finally, the fixed price rule. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the macroeconomic master blueprint, connecting the goods and money markets. So the entire purpose of this model is to show how fiscal and monetary policies impact two absolutely crucial variables in any economy. By mapping out the interactions between the market for physical goods and the market for money itself, we can see exactly what happens when leaders pull the levers of policy. Ultimately, we really want to track where the interest rate, which we'll call little r, and total output, denoted by big Y, will actually end up. Move in right along to Section 2, Consumers, Government, and Taxes, the core components of spending. To build our macroeconomic machine, we first need to understand the groups of people who are actually buying things. Now, private consumption is driven by disposable income, which is really just your total income minus taxes. When your income grows, your consumption grows. But because human nature dictates that we save a little bit of every new dollar, or, at least we should, that growth is dictated by the MPC, or marginal propensity to consume. This is just a fraction that always falls strictly between 0 and 1. You spend a portion of every extra dollar and you save the rest. And here's a super common misconception we really need to avoid. In this specific Keynesian model, your everyday shopping habits are driven by your disposable income? Absolutely not by the current interest rate. Whether the interest rate is sitting at 2% or spiked to 10%, it doesn't change the basic formula for private consumption in this framework at all. Okay, looking at the government side, things are actually even simpler because their spending and taxation are just fixed external decisions. Let's say fixed government spending is set at 500, but the fixed taxes they collect only amount to 400. In this scenario, government savings sit at a negative 100. And that negative 100 is what we call a budget deficit. It simply means the government is injecting more money into the economy than it's pulling out. That brings us to Section 3, interest rates drive investment. This is the business decision engine. So we have our consumers and our government. Now let's bring in real-world business investments. The relationship between interest rates and real investment is basically a giant seesaw. When money is cheap to borrow, meaning rates are low, the net present value of future business projects rises and real investment shoots right up. Conversely, when rates are high, that value drops and investment falls. Section 4, building the IS curve, representing the goods market. Now that we've got consumers, government, and investment, we can combine them into aggregate demand and build our first major subsystem, the IS curve. By the way, IS stands for investment equals savings. You'll inevitably see this curve sloping downward on a graph. But why? Well, to figure that out, we have to trace the exact cause and effect chain reaction in the goods market. Imagine for a second that the interest rate rises. Because borrowing is suddenly way more expensive, real business investment drops. Less investment means total aggregate demand in the economy drops. And finally, that lower demand forces overall economic output to fall. That negative relationship, where high rates literally crush output, is exactly why the IS curve slopes downward. Let's flip to the other side of the coin. Section 5, building the LM curve, or the money market. Let's make sure we contrast our two markets so we don't get them mixed up. While the IS curve maps physical goods and services, the LM curve maps liquidity. LM stands for liquidity preference and money supply. It's a totally different balancing act. It's driven by the actual supply of money printed by the central bank, weighed against the demand for money, like the physical cash people actually want to hold in their wallets for transactions. So if the IS curve slopes downward, why does the LM curve always slope upward from left to right? Unlike the goods market, the logic here relies heavily on what a growing, booming economy does to the public's demand for physical cash. Think about it this way. Step 1, economic output rises. The economy is absolutely humming. Step 2, because of this boom, the demand for money, actual cash for daily transactions, rises. People are buying more stuff. But here's the catch in Step 3. The money supply is completely fixed by the central bank. If everyone suddenly wants more cash but there isn't any extra to go around, the price of holding that money, which is the interest rate, must go up to rebalance the market. Higher output forces a higher interest rate, and there is your upward sloping LM curve. Section 6. The Fixed Price Rule. The Keynesian Short Run. We've built both of our curves, but before we can let this machine actually run, we have one non-negotiable rule. In the short term, overall market prices are completely rigid. They're fixed. They literally cannot adjust downward quickly. This means when demand shifts in our model, it immediately impacts the physical production of goods, the actual output, rather than just causing prices to fluctuate. By putting all these specific assumptions together, we've constructed a beautifully logical engine. Consumption relies on disposable income. Government spending and taxes are fixed dials. Investment opposes interest rates. And prices are totally frozen. In this contained environment, fiscal and monetary levers perfectly dictate the dance between interest rates and national output. We can see exactly what's going to happen to the economy when a policy changes. But I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. We just saw how this entire short-run machine relies completely on the assumption of fixed prices, right? So what happens to this machine when sudden, rampant inflation strikes the real world and prices are suddenly anything but fixed? Figuring out how economists adapt this model for shifting prices is exactly where macroeconomics gets even more fascinating. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the machine works. Welcome back to the explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining me today because we are tackling an absolute cornerstone of macroeconomics, the IS curve. If you've ever stared at economic models and felt, a bit overwhelmed by the alphabet soup of variables and intersecting lines, please don't sweat it. Today, we're clearing all of that up. We're going to focus purely on the mechanics of the IS curve itself. Nothing more, nothing less. We'll break down exactly how it's built and how it moves, step by logical step. To make this really stick, we'll use a deconstruction approach. We'll start with a quick introduction to the IS curve, move into its 3 building blocks, look at moving along the curve, explore the ripple effect, and finally, wrap things up with shifting the entire curve. Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, Introduction to the IS curve, the foundation. Because to understand how a machine works, you obviously first need to know what it actually does. At its core, the IS curve represents the aggregate demand for output in a closed economy. Now, by closed economy, we just mean we're completely ignoring international trade for a minute. No exports, no imports. We're looking strictly at the total picture of the domestic market's output. Think of the IS curve as giving us a snapshot of the total demand for goods and services across different interest rates. All right, let's pop the hood for Section 2, the 3 building blocks deconstructing the formula. We're going to break down the aggregate demand formula. That's Y equals C plus G plus I. Let's walk through these 3 components logically because it's pretty intuitive once you see it. First up, C stands for private consumption. This is basically everyday spending by you and me. It's heavily driven by our disposable income, which we represent as Y, total output or income, minus T for taxes. Makes sense, right? Next, we have G for government spending. In this specific model, we treat government spending as a fixed variable. It doesn't change based on output. And similarly, taxes, or T, are also fixed here, acting essentially like a flat poll tax. Finally, we get to I for investments. This is the really fluid part of our equation. Investments act as a negative function of the interest rate, which we call R. Simply put, when the interest rate is high, borrowing money is expensive, so investments naturally drop. Let's move on to Section 3, moving along the curve, the internal mechanics. This is where things get really dynamic. We need to see what happens inside the economy when that fluid variable, the interest rate, starts to shift. Imagine we start out at point A, where the interest rate is high. Because borrowing is so pricey, investments are low, and as a result, our total output is also pretty low. But watch this logical domino effect. Step 1, the interest rate drops. So we move down the curve toward point B. Step 2, suddenly borrowing money is a whole lot cheaper, which means investments across the economy start to rise. And step 3, this surge in investment directly causes our total output, Y, to increase. So as we slide right down along the IS curve from point A to point B, aggregate demand is growing for the simple reason that lower interest rates are fueling higher investments. But the story actually doesn't end there. Let's look at Section 4, the ripple effect, how growth feeds itself. there's a fascinating secondary effect happening behind the scenes here that is absolutely crucial. What's really interesting is how that initial spark creates a ripple effect throughout the whole economy. Remember how output grew because of those higher investments? Well, when total output grows, it means the overall income in the economy is growing too. Since we know our taxes are fixed, a higher total income means that disposable income, that Y minus T, is also growing. And what do people do when they have more disposable income? They spend it. Private consumption rises. This perfectly illustrates the full picture of our internal movement. By the time we hit point B, private consumption is actually much greater than it was back at point A. So our overall aggregate demand is growing rapidly as we move down the curve because we have this awesome dual engine driving it. Investments are up because of the lower interest rate, and private consumption is simultaneously up thanks to higher disposable income. They're working together to drive output way up. Up until now, we've only been talking about sliding up and down a stationary model. Let's pivot to Section 5, shifting the entire curve. External shocks. It is incredibly important to separate these two concepts, as it's a classic pitfall to mix them up. Moving along the curve is triggered purely by a change in the interest rate. The curve itself stays exactly where it is. But shifting the entire curve, literally moving the whole setup, is triggered by changes in those external factors we originally said were fixed, namely government spending or taxes. Which brings us to a really critical question. If we know that external factors move the curve, what exactly has to happen to cause the entire IS curve to shift outward, to the right? A rightward shift, let's call it moving to IS1, means that at any given interest rate, the total output is now higher than it was before. According to our model, this happens under two specific conditions. First, an increase in government spending. Since G is a direct piece of our aggregate demand formula, pumping more fixed government money into the economy instantly shifts the whole curve to the right. The second condition? A decrease in taxes. Lowering taxes immediately boosts disposable income, which spikes consumption, and boom, that also shifts the entire curve to the right. So the crucial takeaway here is this golden rule. The IS curve essentially acts as a mirror, reflecting the economy's exact output at any given interest rate. We've seen how interest rates pull the internal levers of investment and consumption, and how government spending and taxes can grab the whole system and shift it externally. Understanding these mechanical relationships is absolutely key to unlocking macroeconomic theory. But here's a thought to leave you with. If the IS curve perfectly maps out the goods market, what do you think happens when we introduce the messy, complex money market into this exact same space? That intersection is where the real economic magic happens, and it's absolutely what you'll want to explore next. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the moving parts of our world fit together. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today we're taking on a really foundational piece of macroeconomics, the ISLM model. But, instead of getting totally overwhelmed by the whole thing all at once, we're going to focus our absolute attention on just one half of it. We are going to master the LM curve. By the end of this explainer, you aren't just going to know what the LM curve looks like, you'll understand exactly how it's built from the ground up, starting directly from the basic mechanics of the money market. I promise, once you see the logic play out step by step, it's all going to click perfectly into place. Here's exactly how we're going to break this down today, so it's super digestible. First, we'll cover money market basics. Second, output and interest rates. Third, deriving the LM curve. And finally, we'll look at shifts versus movements. We're moving strictly step by step, so you definitely won't get lost. All right, let's hit section 1, the money market and its basic concepts. Let's start with the demand side, which economists simply call L. So L is the demand for money in the economy. Now, how much money people and businesses actually want to hold in their hands or in liquid accounts is driven by two main things. First, it's heavily influenced by the interest rate, R. And there's an inverse relationship here. Think about it. If the interest rate is super low, there's literally very little reward for locking your cash away in savings or bonds, right? So your demand to just hold on to liquid money is much greater. Lower interest rate equals higher demand for money. The second factor is the level of output, Y, which we're going to explore in detail in just a second. Now for the other side of the equation, M, the money supply. You'll often hear this referred to as M over P, which just accounts for the real money supply. Here is the absolute most important thing to remember about M. It is perfectly rigid. It doesn't just change on its own. It's literally just a straight vertical line. The only way this money supply changes is if a central bank steps in and actively decides to expand or contract the monetary base. Until they make that move, the supply is completely fixed. And that brings us to equilibrium. The foundation of our entire model rests on this exact moment of balance. Equilibrium in the money market happens when the demand for money, L, perfectly aligns with that rigid supply of money, M. Whenever anything in the economy shifts, the interest rate will naturally adjust until these two forces, demand and supply, are perfectly balanced once again. Moving to Section 2, Output's Effect on Interest. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how we introduce the dynamic element of our economy into that static equilibrium we just established. We're going to look at what happens when the level of output, Y, starts to change. Let's walk through this chain reaction very slowly, because this is the core engine of the LM curve. Step 1, economic output, or Y, rises. People are making more, they're buying more, the economy's growing. Step 2, because there's more economic activity, the demand for money naturally goes up. People just need more cash for all these transactions. So our money demand curve, L, shifts completely to the right. Step 3, we've got higher demand, but remember our rule, the money supply is perfectly rigid. It hasn't moved an inch. So if demand goes up, but supply stays exactly the same, the price of holding that money has to go up. Because of that, the interest rate, R, is forced to rise to reestablish our equilibrium. You can kind of think of the different levels of output as characters in our economic story. We start with Y0, our baseline level of output. The economy's cruising along, we have a baseline demand for money, and it pairs with a relatively low interest rate. But then our next character enters, Y1. Output rises. The money demand pushes out to L of Y1. And since that supply of money is still stubbornly fixed, the interest rate has to step up to a higher level. Then Y2 enters the scene. Output rises even further. Demand pushes out to L of Y2, forcing those interest rates even higher. It's a very clear pattern. Higher output consistently creates higher money demand, which systematically forces higher interest rates. Section 3, deriving the LM curve. We finally have all the tools we need to actually build this curve. Let's map this out directly. We plot point A, which represents our baseline. Low output, Y0, matched with a correspondingly low interest rate, R0. Next, let's plot point B. As we just learned, when output grows to Y1, the interest rate gets pushed up to R1, so point B gives us a higher output matched with a higher interest rate. The crucial takeaway here is this fundamental rule. Because higher output increases the demand for money, and that increased demand raises interest rates against a fixed supply, the resulting LM curve absolutely must slope upward from left to right. Connect point A to point B, and there it is, our LM curve. Let's really consolidate what we've learned right here. The LM curve isn't just some arbitrary line. It's a visual representation of the continuous money market equilibrium we just plotted. Every single point on that upward sloping line represents a specific combination of interest rate, R, and output, Y, where the demand for money perfectly equals the supply of money. It's basically an unbroken map of balance. Let's move to Section 4, Shifts versus Demand Changes, and see how this builds into the final and most dynamic part of our explainer. Which brings us to a massive, critical question. And what happens when the money supply actually moves? We've spent this whole time saying it's completely rigid and fixed. But what happens when the central bank decides it's time to intervene? Let's look at the exact mechanics of a monetary expansion. Step 1, the central bank decides to expand the monetary base. They push the real money supply from M/P0 to a larger level, M/P1. Step 2, suddenly, there's just more money available in the market than before, relative to the demand. So the price of holding money goes down, which means the interest rate drops. Step 3, because the interest rate is now lower at every single level of output, the entire LM curve physically shifts to the right. And of course, if the central bank performed a monetary contraction and shrank the money supply, the exact opposite would happen, and the entire curve would shift to the left. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the most important distinctions in all of macroeconomics. You've got to clearly separate these two mechanics in your mind. A movement along the curve is driven internally. It happens when output changes, which changes money demand, causing interest rates to slide up or down that existing line. During all of this, the money supply remains rigidly fixed. Now, compare that to a shift of the entire curve. That is an external shock. It's driven strictly by monetary policy, when the central bank steps in and actively alters the money supply itself. Internal changes in output walk you up and down the stairs. Central bank policy picks up the entire staircase and moves it to a completely different room. So we've built the LM curve from scratch. We know exactly why it slopes upward, and we know what makes it shift entirely. But remember, this is just the money market side of the equation. Since movements along the curve are driven by economic output and shifts are controlled by central bank monetary policy, how do these two massive forces ultimately interact to shape our broader economy? Well, to answer that, we need to bring in the other half of the model, the IS curve. But that is a fascinating exploration for another time. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep focusing on those building blocks, and I'll see you in the next explainer.